Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, January 17th, 2001, the company Pets.com stopped trading on the NASDAQ stock exchange. If you were holding Pets.com stock, it had not been a good few months, and today was definitely not a good day. For many months at this point, Pets.com was imploding. It was the highest profile company to go bust during the 2001 dot-com bubble. The liquidation of the company would be complete just a couple days later, January 18th. So let's talk about Pets.com, the 2001 bubble, and some lessons about the stock market, the economy, and lots more. Here, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Jody.
And our special guest this episode is Julia Furlan, podcast host and producer, and she was the host of the series Go for Broke, which is a new podcast series from Vox about the dot-com crash of 2000. Julia, it's really nice to have you on. Thanks for doing this.
Hi, it's my pleasure. I assure you, I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, really fun series, and I also should say that I guess it's a series that will look at other bubbles and crashes in theory in future seasons.
In the future, yeah.
But this was 01, and I think Pets.com, is the most defining crash of it all. So give us a sense, before we talk about the implosion, give us a sense of the ascension. I mean, how big was Pets.com?
There are lots of different versions of big that Pets.com ended up getting to be. I would say the most significant way that Pets.com was big is that it was absolutely everywhere. There was this sock puppet that most people remember. Basically, this poor sock puppet took the fall for the entire bubble. The sock puppet was this emblem of Pets.com that absolutely propelled the company to the largest stage in the advertising world, which was the Super Bowl. But Pets.com basically, it got up to 250-ish employees total. It got to the size of spending $11 million on advertising, just over $500,000 in revenues. And it only existed for 18 months. So it's pretty significant in that sense. It really was a flop.
Yeah.
It seems like they were playing to their strengths. I mean, the thing that they seemed to be very good at was branding, and the thing that they seemed very bad at was selling pet supplies.
Right. I mean, it's one of these things. It's a different moment in time, but there was this hope that the internet was going to transform everything, which obviously it did. But there was this belief that if you just put .com at the end of something, then it was going to be huge. And to a certain extent, Pets.com had a really solid idea. I mean, I don't know if either of you have pets, but Chewy.com is a home delivery pet product service. However, shipping, logistics, there were a lot of things that were not figured out in 1999, 2000, 2001 that made it almost impossible to turn a profit on pet food and pet products.
Well, this is something I think about a lot because with Pets.com, because when you think about, we can get into some of their examples, but when you think about disruptors in .com disruptors, a lot of them do sometimes address big parts of our life. I mean, I think even Airbnb is travel, and Uber is about transportation, like these sort of more fundamental things. And to me, it's always been in the back of my head, like pets.com, like it's just pet food, or it's like a chew toy. Like why did people sort of say that this was the big unicorn disruptor? But I will also say, just to complicate it, that in listening to your episode, Julia, I think you make a pretty good case that actually, like, pets are really a big part of people's lives, and that actually, when you build a product, you want to do something that connects to something that people are really impassioned by. And so maybe pets.com was the thing to kind of drive this massive new wave of internet disruption.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a $23 billion industry, the pet product industry. So, like, of course you would want in on that. There was a lot of room for growth, to be clear. And it's not a terrible idea. People didn't want to, like hauling cat litter up 4 flights of stairs is not like, I would love to not have to do that, Yeah. But it also, the company, they were flying the airplane as they built it, which I don't know anything about aerodynamic engineering, but it doesn't seem like a great setup,
Yeah.
What I find interesting is that Amazon was pretty heavily invested in pets.com. And you look at both of those models and you can imagine, as an outsider who knows nothing about economics, which is me, thinking that those are basically the same idea, but one was massively successful and one wasn't.
Right. I mean, it's important to remember that Amazon at that time was mostly books. Mm-hmm. It was mostly competing against Barnes & Noble and Borders, and it was mostly shipping books.
I mean, the only thing that I can think of that's different is that there's not as much markup in pet supplies. And so there wasn't really the room to make the kind of money that Jeff Bezos was making over there at Amazon.
The margins are razor thin on pet products. And the products are very heavy, which if you're shipping from, if you're shipping from Indiana where they had a warehouse to Hawaii, that's pretty expensive shipping wise. Amazon just had more money. Like, Amazon had more time, and they were super hyper focused on customer happiness. So they would like ship free replacements all the time, and that's a pretty expensive thing to do if a customer was unhappy. So they kept getting repeat customers. And one of the marketing experts that I spoke to in the production of this show basically said that, like, pets.com did not have a lot of repeat customers. People were using pets.com. They had a magazine that was like super glossy and beautiful, but like it was basically being used to give $25 off coupons. Yeah. So they kept giving discounts and discounts and discounts, but they didn't have a lot of repeat customers. And that's a real problem at the beginning of a business. And also Jeff Bezos just, got to hang around a lot longer, clearly.
But you do get that sense with pets.com that, that maybe the people who ran it were more interested in having a .com than, providing people with pet supplies, right? And like, I have a cat. I get my stuff through Chewy, and like one of the things they do right, well, first off, they turn you into a repeat customer very easily because you can do like recurring orders as like their default. But then also like it just has this vibe of like, we're into pets and this is about pets, whereas pets.com had this vibe of like, we're going to ride this rocket ship internet thing, and it just so happens to be the pet thing. And I feel like often that's the place where the red flag goes up.
Yeah, exactly. That makes so much sense. I mean, at Chewy, the main difference between Chewy.com and pets.com is like, 10 years of logistics and internet improvements. And also that like recurring order function allows them to plan revenue in a way that pets.com was not able to plan their revenue. Also, pets.com, ultimately, they really invested in the thing that they were good at. And the thing that they were good at was marketing. and it was a time when many, many companies were just like, okay, if you want to get to the moon, you're going to, like, the rocket you're going to ride is TV advertising. And having a really clever ad and getting it everywhere was sort of like the number one technique for trying to get the word out there.
It does kind of point to the limits of the mascot as a form of branding. Like, it's a great form of entertainment. And I certainly still remember the sock puppet, even though it's been like 2 decades. But companies like Amazon and companies like Chewy, I don't think they have mascots. Right. But they managed to stick around nonetheless because they were actually able to deliver goods. They were actually able to meet a need in a way that they weren't. So, yeah, it was brilliant advertising. It had this kind of stickiness that very few mascots actually do, but it doesn't turn into business.
So I think we've effectively thrown the sock puppet under the bus, and I think we've painted a good picture of the mismanagement within Pets.com. But I do also, I think the real lesson here and the real story here is about, as you explore, Julia, in your series, the larger bubble and the people who were willfully inflating it, kind of knowing that it was a bubble. And Pets.com, I think, was in many ways just willing to go along for the ride. So start to paint that picture, especially for people who weren't, alive at the time or aware at the time, what exactly it was to have that first internet fervor bubble and who was artificially inflating it.
Yeah, I think it's hard for anyone to really picture what it was like because we are, our necks are bending differently because of our phones. But it was as if the internet was going to make everything a massive business. So when you used to have a business, you would sell to the people who were physically near you, and the internet all of a sudden was going to make it possible for you to sell to the whole world. And that amount of potential, I think it cannot be understated. And Pets.com was there for a really particular moment. They were not alone. There were a lot of other companies who all of a sudden were like, okay, let's do this. Let's sell to everyone. It's all going to be possible. But not everybody had the internet. It wasn't that fast. It took 60 seconds for a web page to load. It was still so new that people were skeptical of putting their credit cards online. There was a lot that felt a little bit uncertain about the internet and its potential. But Pets.com and the economy at large wasn't wrong about the potential, ultimately. Fundamentally, here we are,
Yeah.
Well, and I think that there's also some blame to be placed on financial institutions who were helping to rapidly inflate this bubble. So an institution like Merrill Lynch is continuing to fund and keep afloat Pets.com long after it made sense, because they were collecting all of these investment banking fees. And so here's this little mini lesson from 1999 to 2000, 2001, where you learn about all of these shady finance and investment practices inflating a huge bubble and watching that bubble pop. And fast forward 6 years and everyone has learned their lessons and nothing bad has happened.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's important to shout out, there was a huge scandal surrounding now somebody who people would think is a media person, but then he was an analyst named Henry Blodgett. If you turned on the TV in a bar in New York in 2000, 2001, it was totally possible that you would be watching CNBC. And they made a choice to cover the stock market like it was football. And so you would see analysts becoming stars. There's a punk rock song featuring Maria Bartiromo because Joey Ramone watched CNBC. So it was a time when there was a lot of hot air pumping this bubble, and it was getting bigger on purpose. And there were a lot of practices that made it so that it was in the financial interest and not necessarily the ethical interest of these big banks to take companies public.
Yeah. And of course, Niki, to your point, in 2008, we see so many of these similar dynamics. We have Jim Cramer kind of pumping stocks for much longer than he actually should. And we have, people double dealing and invested in various ways that cut against each other. So, as we start to wrap up, I guess that's, Julia, I think one of the things I'm curious where you're at in terms of, what lessons are there, both in terms of bubbles, but also this question I've been thinking a lot about in this year, in 2020, and, what counts as basically the third half of 2020 in my mind, where we are right now. But, like this disconnect that is between the stock market and the economy. And this was a year in which obviously we had a stock crash, but then quickly just rose. And, the stat you hear about, billionaires made more money than ever this year. And some people are like jumping into the stock market and playing it like it's a game, while other people are, standing in bread lines. Where's your head at, and what lessons are there from 1999 about that seemingly fundamental disconnect?
I mean, I think you just said it very perfectly, but like if it feels wrong, it probably is. Like if it feels like something is too good to be true, or if the economy is doing something that seems a little bit weird, it probably is weird. I spoke to an economist named Rana Foroohar who basically laid out the fact that right before the pandemic hit, many of the tech companies that we are now relying on were really getting a little bit wobbly here in terms of their valuations. You saw like absolutely skyrocketing valuations. WeWork is an emblem of this, where it had a less than ideal IPO situation. I mean, it's very complicated, but in a basic way. But then the pandemic hit, and the economy went entirely digital, and it really transformed a lot of things that I think we're going to still see in the next months and years. There obviously we'll see the reverberations, and you couldn't have planned for that. But I think that if there's a lesson to be learned, it's that like planning is fake. You don't know what's coming. And if it feels weird, there's a reason for that. It's because it's weird and it's not okay, probably.
Yeah, and I would add just a couple of lessons to that. One, a friend of mine said on Twitter that the stock market is the mood ring of the plutocracy. And that, I think, is a pretty good description of what it is, and it is not the economy. And the disjuncture between the two of those and our confusion about the two of those things has led us down a very bad path on more than one occasion.
Yep.
And I would also just say, like, banks don't learn. You've got to set rules so that they don't continue to chase just like the most profitable venture, because we've been through so many bubbles in the past several years, and we keep rolling back those regulations just so that they can come back and make more money. And it seems like a really bad idea because it always ends in the same place. So those are at least two lessons that you can scrape from the pets.com debacle.
Yeah, and I would add only one more lesson, which is like maybe learn your history. That maybe you should listen to a really good podcast about it. So like you can maybe not do the same thing that you already did,
Contribute to the podcast bubble.
Exactly. Well, yeah, talk about bubbles, man.
Right?
I
know.
I will ride this one until but and the political dimension here too. I mean, we're coming off of a presidency and a president who was obsessed with the stock market and willfully ignorant of the difference between the economy and the stock market.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly dangerous as well. But again, like WeWork imploded, some other places imploded. Like Airbnb had this massive IPO just a couple months ago, and those keep happening, and I'm be very curious to see. Which is all to say, I think you're going to have plenty of future seasons of your show to do, Julia. So I don't think.
Unfortunately, I will be here riding these wild moments when people really like lose the plot, and I hope it doesn't happen again, but it probably will.
The series is Go for Broke. It's a podcast from Vox, and Julia Furlan is the host. So thank you for doing this, Julia.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with our transcripts, which you can find at thisdaypod.com. Thanks to everyone who gets in touch with questions or comments or potential topics. You can email us, thisdaypod@gmail.com. One last thing, next episode we have a very special, very exciting announcement. So if you're still listening to the credits at this point, thank you very much. And you get to know that there is something really cool coming up next episode. So be sure to tune in for that. We're very excited about it. I think you will be too. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.